Hello and welcome to a very special event. Thank you for joining us and happy National Family Caregivers Month. Whether you're currently a caregiver, have been a caregiver in the past, or may be one in the future, we're glad you are here with us today. I'm Marta Rañón, Executive Vice President of Southern Caregiver Resource Center, based in San Diego, California. Shortly, we will be welcoming our guests to join us, but first, I'd like to take a moment to share about the California Caregiver Resource Centers, often referred to as CRCs. The CRCs are a network of 11 centers throughout California which serve family caregivers. There are over 4.5 million caregivers in California at various stages in their caregiving journey, and we are here to support you. Since the 1980s, the CRCs have provided a variety of services, including case management, support groups, educational classes, counseling, respite care, legal and financial consultation. So who exactly are family caregivers? Caregiver is a term used to broadly describe a relative or close friend who provides unpaid or informal assistance to someone like a parent or a spouse with a debilitating condition. In other words, you are a caregiver if you regularly provide tangible and or emotional help to another person and feel responsible for their well-being. And today, I am so excited to be chatting with team members from the California Department of Aging. The CRCs are actually funded in part by the California Department of Aging, and we are very grateful for all the work California has done to support older adults and family caregivers. Please welcome Michelle Johnston and Tanya Bautista. I would like to introduce our guests. Hi, how are you? I would like to introduce our guest. Our first guest is Michelle. Michelle joined CDA on August 2nd, 2022, so just recently, as their first program director for dementia initiatives. In this role, Michelle is leading a pilot program in 7 communities with providers of dementia, capable adult day services to address the health and well-being of older adults and their caregivers, prevent or delay institutionalization, and advance health equity. She is also working on federal grants, introducing community health workers as dementia care team navigators in 3 counties, and supporting California's Alzheimer's disease and related disorders advisory committee. She has a Master's of Public Health degree from San Diego State University. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Happy to have you. And now I'd like to introduce Tanya Bautista. She is the Supportive Services Bureau Chief for California Department of Aging and manages 11 programs, including caregiver resources and digital divide for older adults and adults with disabilities, as well as oversee CDA's expertise and resources to address the behavioral needs and elder justice opportunities for older adults. She has a Master's in Public Administration from the University of Southern California. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks so much for having us. We're happy to support and be here.
That's so wonderful. As we wrap up National Family Caregivers Month, I want to start our conversation by talking about our personal experiences as family caregivers. I am sure many of you have heard me talk about my own personal experience. I used to care for my aunt. She was my grandmother's sister, so very far removed from the lineage of caregiving. And I was helping her because she was frail, she was in need of assistance on a daily basis, and she also had some cognitive impairment, memory loss. And I thought I could do it all. I thought I could just pick up a brochure, give someone a call, and get all the questions answered. But of course, as many of us know, many of us who have been caregivers, that is not as easy to do, especially because there is really an emotional toll to the work that caregivers do. So Tanya, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your role as a family caregiver.
Absolutely. No, I'm happy to share. Being part of a Latin family, we're a large family, and we certainly support much caregiving throughout pretty much my childhood. But more recently, with my three children, I have a 4, 6, and 9-year-old. We had to come together and provide caregiving to my sister-in-law, who recently suffered from multiple strokes and needed and really wanted to be home, did not want to go to assisted living. She wanted to be home and she wanted to be around her family, and so we really did as much as we could to make that a comfortable environment for her while she needed assistance with activities of daily living. As we know, going to the bathroom, taking showers, being able to swallow was very difficult for her, so mixing the water and making sure it wasn't something that would get into, her lungs, and showing my children how to love and care for their aunt through that experience. Unfortunately, she did end up on hospice care, and helping her through that as well in that end of life and experience was important for me and my children to navigate, because that's something that's important to us and our culture and how we support them. So, it was a beautiful experience. It was something that we had to definitely exercise a lot of the self-care practices that we hear a lot about. The CRCs promote a lot of great guidance that I'm aware of, that we practice, like, making sure we get enough sleep, that we're getting, we're eating enough, and we're taking care of our health, and um, because that's important to be successful in our role as a caregiver. So that was something that I really wanted to model for my children and make sure they understood that it's not scary. It's not something that we have to stress and be, it's sad, but we can still love and have a good time and make the best of it. So that's something we navigated this past summer, and my children really thrived in that experience. So I'm grateful for that, and I'm grateful for the resources that continue to develop. So as they grow and need to continue to support that with other family members, they'll know where to go and how to be resourceful in that matter.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Tanya. I am so glad that you were able to have that experience, as challenging as it may have been with your children, so that you can model that for them. Michelle, tell us about your caregiving experience.
Sure. My first caregiving experience started over 20 years ago. My grandmother had ALS. And so we, as a family, I grew up in Mendocino County in a rural community, and I grew up on the same street as my grandparents and my aunts and uncles. So family was, all around and together. And even though I moved to Sacramento, I still came back and helped provide caregiving for her with other members of my family. And what I learned in that journey was we were able to tie into resources that were available, although they weren't available in the community they were in. We were fortunate to be close enough to the Bay Area that we could go and access great care and support for people with ALS, which is a more rare disease than others. And so my next care journey, after she passed away a few years later, my father had Parkinson's, and then he ended up with dementia related to Parkinson's disease. But like so many other family members who have a loved one with a form of dementia, we weren't told of his diagnosis. So we didn't exactly know what was going on as a family. We did pretty well caregiving anyway. But there's so much more we could have done if the doctor had told us what the diagnosis was and had connected us with resources in the community, like the caregiver resource centers and other groups. So that journey was, I think, a little bumpier than it had to be. And then he passed away. And then a few years after that, I helped care for my grandfather, who had cardiovascular health issues. He made it almost to 94. So he had this kind of standard, some of those end of life issues that people have. And so my journeys were very different based on our interactions with the healthcare system and how they were able to connect us or not connect us with resources. And But I was super lucky because I was in the kind of job where I could work remotely sometimes. I had paid leave where I could take time off to go and help care for them. And I know that so many people don't have that. So it was really, just fortunate that I had those abilities, and others in my family did as well, to be able to help provide that care for our loved ones at home.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Michelle. And I think it's so important to be able to recognize that sometimes we do need to ask for help. And we are so fortunate to live in California. This is a state at the forefront of caregiving services. And CDA has an ecosystem of resources. So I want to ask Tanya, what does CDA do to support families?
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to answer that. Um, we have certainly over the last year uh, really built up a strong network that continues to evolve, both internally as a department, and then that translates externally to our partners who support the local communities. And what that looks like is there's kind of two networks that we really utilize to this effect. One is our 33 area agency or area aging agencies, or AAA network, and many of them are strong partners with the CRC network, which is fantastic throughout the state. So I'm sure many of the folks on this call probably are familiar with these groups. So across the state, these 33 area agencies provide caregiver resources for unpaid caregivers. And much of that looks like resources that include respite care, training, outreach, education, and case management. They're a fantastic resource. And on our CDA website, we do have phone numbers and ways to navigate how to contact the AAAs, including reaching out to myself. I'm happy to support how we connect effectively as a state to all the local resources. But in addition to the AAA network, our area agencies, we also have the CRC, the wonderful CRC network that we support. So my team, we have a caregiver resources unit, a newly formed caregiver resources unit. And so our job as a team is to really make sure that we're networking effectively with the CRCs and all the amazing resources and all the models of care and support and case management that the teams are doing really it's effectively statewide and integrates into all the amazing programs that are going on right now. And really, many of them have such an amazing amount of, how do you say, the historical legacy work that we want to leverage and be able to understand in a way that we can say let's model the way and move it and scale it up to the state level. So that's a lot of the work that we're doing for families, so that way the great resources that we're seeing, like as Michelle mentioned, like in the Bay Area or San Diego, where we know they have amazing models of care, that can also then translate to Humboldt County and Sacramento County, and that there's a consistent approach. So if a family caregiver needs to move or go to another area where there's a hospital that better serves their family member, they can receive the same level of care. So that's a lot of the work that my team and I are taking on, and it's part of the efforts that we want to maintain with both the CRC network and the AAA network. I'm sorry, I'm using the acronyms that's common to the state departments, but they're well-established networks and they do amazing work. So we really look forward to, as a state department, continuing to building up and scaling up so much of those resources. Again, that has the outreach, case management supports, and when families reach out to them, a key aspect to this is the no wrong door approach. We want to make sure that when family members reach out, when unpaid caregivers, essentially in any capacity, family members or our loved ones, friends, need support, want to have learn more about the resources, that they are able to reach someone effectively and talk about. what it is that could be made available to them. And so, for example, we know that the CRC's specialty is very much about, the organic brain degenerative, diagnoses. But we understand, like, for example, with my sister-in-law, strokes and other, physical impairments occur that need support as well. And when I talk about the no wrong door support, that's very much how the CRCs and our AAA network operates. Is we're going to answer those calls. We're going to talk to those caregivers and listen and figure out a system that's going to work for them and make sure they're supported, with regards to what the needs of them as a caregiver is, and the person and the supports that are needed therein. So, as a final point, I wanted to just really highlight something I'm proud of, is that these programs are not income based. There's no threshold to say, oh, are you on Medicare? Are you on Medicaid, Medi-Cal, dual eligibility, or anything to that effect? It really has this open opportunity that if you are an unpaid caregiver, these resources are for you, and that's the threshold. So we're really thrilled to be able to open it up in that manner. And of course, we'll ask those sort of questions in intake about, what is your healthcare coverage, but it has more to do with knowing then what resources we can navigate you to and how to support you in that capacity, because that's what we want to maximize for your benefits. So, there's a lot going on. Integration, no wrong door, those are all things that are very, very big for my role as a bureau chief, trying to establish caregiver resources that are reliable and consistent statewide for all families.
Tanya, I am so glad to hear that there's such collaboration between the department and the CRCs. Having been working in this field for a while, and also a caregiver, and of course a Californian, I'm really proud that anyone can access these services no matter where they find themselves in the state. And that's why it's so important that we talk about the resources that are available. But also I'm curious to talk with Michelle a little bit more about California's Master Plan for Aging. What is that, Michelle?
Sure, yeah. One of the things that brought me to come to work at the California Department of Aging is really all of the exciting things that have gone on in the last 2 to 3 years to really kind of bring this issue to the forefront, right? As we look at our state, by 2030, a quarter of Californians will be age 60 or older. So we know as a state and a country we're aging. And really now we're looking at, how do we make sure we're putting those resources in to be able to support all of these adults and to help them age well. And that's part of the master plan on aging, was released back in 2020. So they started the work in 2019. They continued the work through the start of the pandemic and lockdowns, and managed to get this plan out in 2020. We're just finishing the first 2 years of activities. And so actually in January, we'll be releasing the kind of next 2 years of the master plan. But it's really started with a lot of advocates who were coming forward to state government and saying, hey, this is an issue we need to really start to address more. Governor Newsom's commitment, his own family, they've served as caregivers for loved ones who were ill. And so really just kind of taking that piece and building this plan that's not just a plan that sits on a shelf, but it's a plan that has activities connected with it and partnerships and subcommittees of people working together to make sure that we're actually making progress. You can see the whole plan online. There's a whole dashboard where you can see the data, how are things going. And the plan really revolves around 5 goals. So it's housing for all ages and stages. It's health reimagined, inclusion and equity, not isolation, affordable aging, and caregiving that works. And so that's the piece really, while all of those are important for all of us, this audience in particular, I'm sure is interested, so what are we looking at around caregiving? And so it's really looking at the training and support for both paid caregivers. We know that over 5 million Californians are serving as unpaid caregivers for family and friends, as well as the people in the direct care workforce. So those people providing assistance at home or in community living settings. So California has really continued to invest in the caregiver resource centers, as we've talked about, to provide training and career pathways. So how do we make sure that folks who want to take those important jobs as paid caregivers have the resources, can make a living wage, can get the training that will help them be successful? And then for those unpaid family caregivers, how do we support them as well with training and assistance, with respite? What kinds of things will be helpful to keep us all healthy along this journey? So that piece is really exciting. And I would be remiss, given that a large focus of my job is on issues related to Alzheimer's and other dementias, that around that same time, California also worked on a plan related to Alzheimer's disease prevention and planning. And that was also spearheaded by the governor, Anne Maria Shriver, former First Lady of California, who ran the group who put the task force who put that plan together. And so those objectives kind of run parallel or in conjunction with the master plan objectives. So really focusing some attention in California on, the folks living with Alzheimer's and other dementias and their caregivers, and how we can support them until we can find a way to end the disease.
That's so wonderful to hear, Michelle. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm also very glad to hear from you and the CDA on your efforts to support not only paid family caregivers, but unpaid family caregivers, because I know sometimes there is a mixture of the two terms, and it's really two different entities. Unpaid family caregiver is like many of us who are just caring for a relative or a loved one and are not necessarily doing this as a full-time job where we are getting paid, but we're doing this as a family member or a friend. I wanted to hear from you, Michelle, what perhaps you can talk a little bit more about the goal that the CDA is doing specifically to support family caregivers and that caregiving that works term.
Sure. Yeah, there are lots of different things. So the work of the CRCs, the Caregiver Resource Centers, falls within that, as well as activities. So just in a couple of days, on December 2nd, there's a funding process there where the applications are due for what we call CalGrows. And that program is really offering people who want to do innovative training. And there are training options for the paid caregivers, but then there's also training options for people who want to provide those trainings to unpaid caregivers, be they family or friends. So we're investing a lot. So California's invested more than $2 billion in workforce and pipeline and training incentives, both for in-home supportive services workers, as well as direct care and home and community-based workforce, and then the CalGrows program. We're also looking at opportunities around respite. So one of the projects that I'm working on is called CalCompass, and it's a pilot program with 7 adult day programs or adult day health centers throughout California. So we've picked some of the best people who've been doing this work for 20, 30, 40 years and have a focus on serving those individuals who are living with Alzheimer's or other dementias. So the individual living with the disease comes to the day program. Depending on the program, they get healthcare resources and socialization and meals and all kinds of different things to help them have a great day while their caregiver is getting some respite. So maybe that person, many caregivers work, over half of the caregivers are still working for a paid job as well. And so they want their loved one to be safe and to be engaged during the day while they're at work. And these programs provide that opportunity. So we're working to really kind of pull together all of these best practices and put, what is that model of what California should be doing around adult day programming. And so that then we can work to expand that, to find more sustainable resources for it so that it's more available. But we know that needs workforce, right? And so that's why some of this workforce stuff is so important, because I was just in a meeting yesterday where someone from a day program was talking about, like, these are the hours we would, as they're opening their services up again in person, after, the shutdowns during the pandemic, during the first part of the pandemic, they said, we'd like to be open this many hours and this many days, but right now we can't find the staff for it. We know that there are workforce shortages all over in different fields, and this field is no exception. We know that there are caregivers who want to hire someone to come in the home and help them, but can't find someone right now because of the workforce shortages. So that's definitely something, that as we address will help support caregivers as well.
We are so fortunate to have leadership in our state that prioritizes the need of family caregivers. And I'm so glad to hear from you, Michelle, that there's been this continuity of support throughout the years and the administration to support family caregivers. And so I'm curious, what do you think the future of caregiving would look like, Tanya?
Oh, no, I appreciate that question. So, part of the future is looking at it at a few different levels. One of it, excuse me, I'm sorry. I have a cough. I have a cold. Could you come back to me in just a minute? I apologize.
No problem. It's really amazing, having this conversation with you, Tanya and Michelle, and all the wonderful resources that are available to us in California. And at Southern Caregiver Resource Center, we often hear that people don't know where to get help, or they don't know where to start. I know that was the case for me when I was a family caregiver. It's such a daunting experience, especially at first. And so, Michelle, how can we make sure that family caregivers are connecting with these tools?
Sure. I think actually based on my own family caregiving journey, it was in my father's medical record that he'd been diagnosed with dementia, but the doctor never told us. So I never sought out the resources of, the Alzheimer's Association or other Alzheimer's groups or family caregiver resource centers, because we didn't know what, the diagnosis was. And so I think that that's part of it, is really, and in California, we've taken some great leadership in that area. There's a project now called Dementia Care Aware, where they're providing training to clinicians. There was a bill that was passed a couple of years ago that the Alzheimer's Association and other groups worked on, so that folks who are on Medi-Cal but not Medicare will still be able to get that diagnostic workup when they have a cognitive issue. And then under Dementia Care Aware, training is being provided to physicians so that we know the physicians who see our family members are going to have the skills and know what to do to be able to make that diagnosis, to communicate with the person and their family. And so I think that diagnostic piece is really an important one, especially in a disease like Alzheimer's, where we know a lot of folks don't get the diagnosis. So getting that diagnosis, knowing what you're working with, then you can get connected with those resources. And so there's so many ways that can happen, right? With a healthcare provider, it can happen through the AAA network, like Tanya said. People can call the California Department of Aging. We also have a lot of information on our website. So I would say that as we work to build this no wrong door approach more, that it's, don't be afraid to reach out to someone. And if they're not the right person or group, to ask them, well, who should I connect with? And can you help connect me with them? Because that's really what California is working on, is that, if you're not sure where to go, you go what you've heard of. And then if you got the wrong place, we'll connect you with the right place so that you don't have to kind of get bounced around a lot. And, groups are really working together more with our age and disability resource connections. We know that, sometimes people get connected through an area agency on aging. Sometimes they get connected through an independent living center. Sometimes the services are different. And so really kind of connecting these agencies more so that we can do stuff on the back end to get you everything you need, instead of you having to reach out to multiple agencies to get what you need. When my grandmother was ill with ALS, we got connected with an ALS research and healthcare center in San Francisco. And we would go for an all-day appointment, which, was a big deal to leave Ukiah, at 5 or 6 in the morning to drive through traffic to San Francisco. Um, but when we got there, we saw everyone in the same day. We saw the healthcare provider, we saw the physical therapist, the occupational therapist, the person from the nonprofit, like all the resources came to us. So we didn't have to take my grandmother 15 places to get what she needed. So it's thinking about those kinds of models and how do we help bridge these different groups together so that it's easier for persons with whatever disease they're living with and their caregivers to get what they need in a more easy, less labor intensive fashion for them. Because we know caregivers are already super busy, right? We're doing all these things to help care for our loved one. And now we have to call 15 agencies and we have to go here and fill out this form. And so how do we bridge these groups and make it easier for folks?
And as you were talking, I was reminded of our saying that we have here at Southern Caregiver Resource Center, which is you don't have to do caregiving alone. So remember, there are many other caregivers in your similar situation, so connect with the services that are available to you in your community. And in California really is leading the way to support family caregivers, which are largely unseen, but a critical workforce, like you were talking about, Michelle. So what more can we do to advocate and ensure that these resources continue? Tanya, I don't know if, are you okay? I hope that you were feeling a little better, but I wanted to ask that question.
No, that's great. And I will try my best to keep it going in conversation. But there's advocacy work can never be underrated, especially, coming from a State Department, hearing the voices of experience, especially coming from a local level and elevating it to us, what those needs are, what's working, what's not, is always great. So hearing it from the CRCs, the directors, as they bring it to our attention, we meet with them monthly. That level of advocacy is always very helpful. But, even as a family caregiver, really looking at, you can call CDA anytime. We have a number on our website that's publicly an 800 number, and my team actually is responsible for answering it. So we are happy to support and take calls to that effect. But I did want to kind of go back to the question you originally asked me about what trends are going on. What does the future look like for caregiving? Because I think that's important as far as how it integrates with the advocacy work. At a national level, the Biden administration just released over 150 goals for states and partnering organizations to consider to revitalize and improve our systems for caregiving resources. So we are taking that very seriously as a State Department. We've issued our feedback to the administration on community living. And sorry, and in that perspective, we are integrating that into our strategic planning for how we are going to evolve with our caregiver resources and supports at a state level, which includes, like Michelle was saying with the MPA Goal 4, making sure that folks who are caregivers, they see that as a skill building, resource as well. It's not just a labor of love. It is something that can provide them with some economic relief as well. And that when we really look at integrating into like Howling, for example, we look at how home health services becomes part of a norm that we can all experience and bring into our households, and integrate that as well into supporting our caregiver role, where we can bring.
Looks like we lost her there for a bit, but I would actually like to take a question from our audience at the moment. And that way, Tanya, we give you a chance to get some water and hope you feel a little better. And maybe we can have a question that we can talk about and help answer. So the first question is, I would like to know about determine the best home care programs.
Sure. I'm sure at the CRCs you probably have several questions that popped in your head as well. But I think, depending on what kind of care someone's going to be providing in home for your loved one, one of the things to think about, like, my grandmother with ALS, there were particular skills that we all needed as caregivers in terms of being able to help move her and keep her safe. With my father, there were particular more behavioral things related to his dementia. And so knowing like, okay, so these are the health issues my family member has. What kind of training have you had that will help you be able to provide quality care? So what kinds of training have they had around dementia or other health issues related to what your loved one's experiencing? I think is an important one. I think another thing too is what's their philosophy around caregiving. Different people come at caregiving in different ways. And with different reasons. And so kind of finding out what their philosophy is. Is it really focused on like, I'm just here to provide the care, or is it, I really want to get to know your loved one and kind of be their buddy? And then I think knowing who's going to connect with your loved one. My father wasn't super chatty. So when we interviewed, we did have some paid caregivers help us at one point. And when we interviewed paid caregivers, there was one person who was just really super chatty. And I thought, oh, like this person's really nice, but they're really not, father is not going to connect well with that. So it's like finding those people who can connect with your loved one. In work I'd done in another nonprofit, caregivers would talk about like, my loved one really likes to walk. And so like I found a caregiver who also really likes to walk, so that I know that that's going to get taken care of, as opposed to someone who, had other interests. So I think that's really looking at the interests and personality of your loved one and trying to find that caregiver who fits that.
And I was also
Yeah,
reminded of, in speaking to caregivers, sometimes language is important as you're finding a home care agency to support you. So of course, if they're going to be taking care of someone who speaks, let's say, Spanish, it makes sense to have a home care aide who also speaks Spanish and understands and can converse with that individual. Let's take another question from our audience. And we have here, are there any adult daycare programs that accept Medicare versus Medi-Cal? So maybe Michelle, you want to answer?
Sure. It's not so much that the daycare program accepts it, it's what Medicare covers. So Medi-Cal, for folks who qualify with the home and community-based services, under CBAS, can qualify for adult day. But Medicare doesn't really provide that as a benefit. They provide some short-term rehabilitation and inpatient stays. You may be able to get some kind of home health, like physical therapy or something if your loved one can't come in, but it's not typically a Medicare benefit. Now I know with the Medicare Advantage plans, I believe some of those may be able to provide it, but it's really going to depend on the plan and what you're going to be able to get approved for.
All right, well, thank you so much for that information. I'm sure it can clarify and help as you are going through that process. And we can take another question from our audience. And we have, how can I talk to my employer about my responsibilities as a caregiver? That is a very good question. I think a lot of us have learned that there are many employees who are working full-time but are also caregiving full-time. And especially with the pandemic, we were caregiving became an issue that a lot of us were not even aware of until it happened. So I don't know if Michelle or Tanya who wants to answer this question.
Sure, I don't mind supporting this. One of the key aspects and benefits actually of being in California is we do have a lot of safeguards as employees that we should, consider when we look at our employment status. So what I would encourage you to do is not only talk to your employees and say, this is my situation at home, and I am, having to provide care to a loved one for these conditions. But I would also encourage you to consider it through the perspective of your HR benefits in which you would look at like what are your paid family leave opportunities for that California provides, and being able to get those safeguards in place for you, because you do get benefits for providing services to your loved ones in that manner. Similarly, FMLA is available when you have to provide care to loved ones, and those are things that we definitely want to encourage you all to consider. And when you're talking to your employer, to discuss what are your benefits and how can you make sure that you have those resources. So in case you do have to take time off, you have the FMLA, or there's also CFRA, which is the California type FMLA that's available. So those are things that we highly encourage you to consider. Is definitely be transparent with your employer about what you're experiencing. I think most people are very understanding of the realities of being part of families, and what we have to do and support in our personal lives. But in addition to that, there's so many great benefits when we're working, and to try to get those coverages. I would highly encourage you to anyone to consider.
Thank you, Tanya. And I think that's also very, very important information. So if you are in that situation, make sure you do start that conversation with your employer and get the information that you need. All right, well, if we could take one more question. We have here, I need to find someone that I can trust to help care for my mom. What do you recommend? And I think that is a very good question that a lot of us ponder, because it's our loved one. Nobody understands my mom or the person that I care for the best. So how do we find that right person? And either of you want to answer that question?
Yeah, I honestly would highly recommend starting with your local CRC. I am in working with the directors and all the great services that they provide. I mean, there's a lot of passion in supporting caregivers and navigating the resources and the needs for any particular individual. And part of that is definitely looking at what are the extra supports that are needed. So it's not just helping you as a family caregiver or an unpaid caregiver, being successful in your self-care, but it's also looking at, are there daycare programs that you could use? Are there assisted living resources that might be a good fit? And then similarly, looking at the local caregiver resources that are paid and that you could bring someone into. So I know from my experience in working with the CRCs, they're very involved and they will support helping identify those types of resources, and which ones are the best of the best in your local area, and help you kind of tap into identifying those resources. So I highly recommend. A lot of them have really great respite programs as well, or are partnered with great respite programs that have already identified dedicated caregivers who are reputable. So again, I think starting with your local caregiver resource center would be a great first step, so you can find the best caregiver for that can help support you and your loved one.
Absolutely. And I know that we could probably speak all day on these topics, but before we leave, I'd like to ask each of you to see if there's anything else you'd like to add or share with our audience today. So may we start with you, Michelle?
Sure, just to kind of tap into that last question and prior questions about care. I think there are a couple of other potential resources that we haven't really touched on. And one of those is family and friends or faith communities sometimes have folks who will come and support you as well. A lot of times we like when people ask us for something, right? If I have a friend who's going through a hard time and they need something, I'm happy to help. And a lot of times as caregivers, it's hard for us to ask for help. So if you have a family member or a friend or someone in your faith community who's offered to help, like, is there a way you can have them help you? What kinds of specific tasks do you need support with? Is it, hey, can you stay with mom for a couple hours, the first Wednesday of every month while I go to my caregiver support group. So I get a break, or while I go to my doctor's appointment. And so, because we know that not everyone has resources, the financial resources to be able to hire, people to come into the home. And, sometimes you may qualify for a respite program, or, you might be on a waiting list for something. So looking at what are some of those unpaid caregiver supports that also might be available for us, that don't cost us anything. And then the other one is the Veterans Administration. So some veterans qualify for different benefits. And so it's important to, if your loved one was a veteran, especially a veteran during a time of war, even if they didn't serve a day in a battle, to talk to the Veteran Service Officer in your county and see if there are things that they might qualify for on that end as well.
Thank you for that very important information. Tanya, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, so just for the family caregivers that are on the call, something I want to highlight is that these services are not one and done for anyone. There's something that can be utilized and relied on through the longevity of your role as a caregiver. So the first time you call and you set up case management with, one of your caregiver resource centers, especially, and you decide that the services, you use some of it at that time, and then you want to go back to it 6 months later, or you want to go back to the year or two later. It's always there for you. And I just want to encourage you to see this as a resource that's always available, and it's never just a one-time thing where you exhaust a few hours and then that's it. So I hope that everyone takes the opportunity to recognize that at any point in time these resources are available.
Good reminders. Thank you, Tanya. Well, I am so glad that we were able to have you both participate in this vital conversation. And I also like to thank all of you for joining us today. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening and participating. And as we talked about throughout the event, there are so many resources available to family caregivers. If you live in San Diego or Imperial counties, you can connect with Southern Caregiver Resource Center by going to www.scrc.care. It's right there on your screen. And if you live elsewhere in California, connect with your local CRC by going to www.caregivercalifornia.org. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful day.